Okay, I'm finally ready to tackle the OSI model and try and break it down. Obviously, this is going to be pretty superficial and just a shallow understanding of it, but hopefully it's enough to get the points across of the 7 layers of the OSI model. And essentially, what it is it's a framework. It's a conceptual framework that describes how computers or systems from different vendors can communicate with each other. So if a Cisco device needs to talk to a Linksys device, back in the day they used to be have the same exact manufacturer to be able to communicate. Now we have this open system framework that was developed by the ISO, that's the International Organization of Standardization, and basically there are 7 layers. Um, the as the data passes through from layer to layer, it does something called encapsulation, and encapsulation means that the data stays intact as it travels down through the layers from layer 7 through 1. But as it's progressing through each layer adds a little bit of information about it until it gets down to uh, layer 4 through 1, which is it turns into something called PDUs. So that's where it becomes a segment or a packet or frame or a bit. But let me get there in a minute. So starting with layer 7, that's the application layer. So that's the layer where that's closest to the user. So when you're in Outlook and you type up your email and you hit send, as soon as it goes out on the line, that hits the application layer. So that's your ports. That's HTTP port 80, HTTPS 443, SMTP 25. I'm just trying to remember all the port numbers. So basically, yeah. So it's anything. It's the data that's the closest to the user is the application layer. The next layer down is the presentation layer, and basically what that does is it describes what the data is. So if it's a Word doc, it describes it as a Word doc, or if it's a PDF, or if it's a GIF or GIF, depending on how you like to pronounce it, or a JPEG. It also describes whether it has compression, encryption, all of those types of things, describing what the file is, so that when it gets over to the other side, the other system will know what that file is. The next layer is the session layer, and the simplest way I've seen this described is that at the session layer, it's about it's opening like a phone call, right? So like you pick up the phone, you call, you say hello, your line is open at that point, and then you say goodbye and you hang up, and that is the end of the session. So that's what the session layer is, layer 5. Layer 4, you get down to the transport layer, and that's where your PDU becomes a segment, and that is where it's determined whether the segment going across is either TCP or UDP. Um, TCP means it's the kind of data that goes across that's requiring acknowledgement, where UDP is data usually used for things like streaming, video, audio, anything that like a lot of data that it would be too painful to have to require an acknowledgement on every time. That's UDP data. So it's either TCP or UDP. It's a segment, and that's layer 4. Layer 3 gets down to the network layer, so that's where the PDU gets called a packet, and this is the IP layer. So at layer 3, the IP is goes to the address that it needs to go to, and it's the addressing layer, and it's where the computers actually are connecting versus the session layer where it's the applications that are connecting. Then you get down to layer 2, which is the data layer. At this point, the PDU is called a frame. And the data layer is kind of it connects up to the network layer and it connects down to the physical layer. So at layer 2 with the data layer, it determines what MAC address the data is going to. So the MAC address means every single component that's connected out in the world, or I guess in general, every bit of hardware has a specific ID to it. So having the MAC address at this point, layer 2, you can actually, rather than target an IP address, which could reflect a bunch of different devices at like a house or an apartment or whatever, this tells it to go specifically to a MAC address, which is the actual device. So, and you also have something called LLC here, which is the error detection portion of layer 2. And then finally, layer 1 is the bit PDU, and you're at the very bottom. This is the physical layer, and this is a layer where you're talking about hubs. You're talking about like literally the cables that connect to the computer. It's the physical layer. It's literally uh, the sort of the dumbest part of the whole process. So, and then in turn, after you get to layer 1, then it goes all the way back up from layer up to 7 where it ends. So it goes back and forth and back and forth. And that is the 7 layers of the OSI model. I hope that makes sense. And I'm sure there could be something in there that's not quite right, but I think that generally describes what it is.